my experience has been very good on for me personally, ethically, everything. So again, it's not an easy thing to do, but if you can do it and you feel like it, that you
I've
can
been
do
doing it for 2 weeks now. I've been doing it for 2 weeks now, and I'm really adjusting to it, and it's working for me.
Good. That's good to hear. Tonight, it's good to have everybody here with us tonight. It's kind of a difficult night as we enter into Yom HaShoah, into Holocaust remembrance. And by the way, I'm not on I'm not on Safari, so I'm going to try tonight to not run Safari, and we're going to try to hopefully not have any problems with technology tonight. I can't guarantee anything, but I'm going to try. But so I am going to use Chrome, and I'm going to try to get everybody connected to the Torah portion in a moment. I will tell you, last week we didn't have a portion from Leviticus. We're in the book of Leviticus now. We're in the third portion in Leviticus. So we just started the book of Leviticus, Vayikra. But last week we read a special portion for Passover. So we were reading the portion for Shabbat during the week of the intermediate times. Actually, in this case, it was the end of Passover special portion. We kind of talked about the Torah portions for Passover and talked a little bit about that. And then today we're going to actually look at back to Leviticus, back to where we are in the Torah portion. And as I like to say, this is one of the few times in Leviticus that we actually get a story. We actually get a narrative. And so I really am glad everybody's here with us tonight, because, we like stories.
Hey, I'm in.
The laws are, you're in. The laws are important. The laws are important, and definitely Leviticus is filled with lots of law, but we do love stories. People, human nature, we love tales, and the Torah definitely teaches us through lists of laws and requirements, but oftentimes it does a lot of teaching through narratives and through stories. And so Leviticus this week and Parshat Shmini is a story, and it's not the whole portion, it's the beginning of the portion. But it's actually not a great story. It's a sad story. And we oftentimes read it during the time of Yom HaShoah, which is already by itself is a dark day, because it's a day of remembering the Holocaust. And so sometimes, we do read it around this time, and it intersects. And so we're going to look at it this week, Parshat Shmini. And over the last couple of weeks, we were introduced in the Torah to the priests, to their laws, to their sacrifices, to the work that they do, to the way that they dedicated the tabernacle, what we call the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the first holy space of the Jewish people, the temporary a structure that could be broken down and set back up in different places than it was for 40 years. And so we read about the priests doing their work. And we read 2 weeks ago about the ordination, the week-long inauguration of the holy place. I want to call it the temple, the temporary temple, the temple in the wilderness. And so we read about it, and then on the 8th day, the day that the priests actually get to work, so in a sense, it's the first day of business, because the first week is like a soft opening, which is kind of funny, because even the holiest place in Jewish history had a soft opening, had a week where people were open, but not really open, in the sense that they were creating an energy and a space for what would happen next. You couldn't just open the doors and say, hey, come in. They had to kind of open it up, start to let the energy fill the place, and then open it to the general public, if you will. Well, so in some ways, this is actually the first day of business. And we're going to see what happens on the first day of business. It's not an easy thing to see. And I'm going to now post this up on Facebook so people can join us there. Again, it's great to have the Schulmans with us, and they're in Texas. I'm in Utah. Some people are in Santa Clarita. We're all floating around the sun and the universe, and we're all going different places and in different places, and we're all on the move, even if we don't realize we're on the move. But oh, and I want to say one thing too. Joyce sent me a very interesting article about the Jewish history of Oxford, and it's a very interesting article. I can post the link tonight for it. You don't mind that, Joyce, if I do? I don't know if everyone will be as
not at all.
As about
And
it as I was.
If you click on the places where it says, if you want to know more, click here, that's where you get the real information. You have to go deep into the article and go to the other sections. And it's fascinating to me.
Yeah. And what's so interesting, of course, is that Oxford has this very rich, very wonderful Jewish history until the Jews were actually thrown out of England under King Edward. The Jews had a very interesting history there. And many of them came in with the Norman conquest as merchants and as people that the Normans relied on for business. And so when Edward was kind of finding people to blame for problems that he was dealing with in England, he turned on the Jews and killed many of them and exiled the remaining Jewish community from England. But there were Jews in Oxford for many years, centuries before that. And Oxford was one of those places that had this really special Jewish community. There were students there already from about the 10th century. There were students at Oxford, and the Jewish community there were involved in business, merchant business, but also in education and helping the students learn Hebrew and learn the Bible, and which were required courses for students at Oxford during those times in the Middle Ages. And it's a very interesting history. So I'm going to post the link for it so that you can read about it. Obviously, Oxford has a special place in my heart because I spent a year there, and that's where I met Tracy. And I have lots of very special memories for this place. And what's so interesting is the place that is mentioned here is kind of the landmark place where the Jewish community lived, or the center of what was the Jewish community, Carfax Tower, which is kind of an interesting place towards the center of Oxford, the center of the old town at the end of High Street. I would walk past that every day for, the whole year I was there. I walked past that corner almost every day, if not every day. And to know that the Jewish community, 1,000 years ago was living right there is kind of eerie now for me to think about. But again, there's a lot of places in England that have kind of an ancient Jewish history, but that history is, again, unfortunately also tinged with sadness because the Jews were, as we said, were forced out. So thank you, Joyce. And I posted the link there for you on the chat area, so you can follow that link. And please, if you have any questions about it, let me know. I'm going to share the Torah portion now, and we're all ready to go. And one second, because I'm using, gotta make sure because I'm using Google. Now you should see it. So this is the portion, which again, if you look, is the beginning of chapter 9. And the words Shmini come from the third word of the Torah portion, Vayehi bayom hashmini, on the 8th day, which is what Shmini means, like Shmini Atzeret or Shmona, 8, I know other 8s that in Hebrew. This is the 8th day. Of course, boys are traditionally circumcised on the 8th day because we come around from the first week, and then this is the first day of the new week, if you will. So according to tradition, this takes place, by the way, on the 1st of Nisan, which is the month that we're in right now. the month of springtime. So we read this portion usually around the time that it happened, a few weeks later. So this happened just before Pesach. The temple was inaugurated, or the Mishkan was inaugurated. And here we go. Here's what happens. On the 8th day, Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. He said to Aaron, take a calf of the herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering without blemish, and bring them before the Lord. So far, we've heard this stuff before. And speak to the Israelites, saying, take a he-goat for a sin offering and a calf for a lamb, yearlings without blemish for a burnt offering, and an ox and a ram for an offering of well-being to sacrifice before the Lord, and a meal offering with oil mixed in. For today the Lord will appear to you. So far again, seems to be consistent with what Moses has said they're going to do. They're going to offer these animals. They're going to be offering them for different things, for sin offerings, for well-being offerings, of what we call an offering of shalom, an offering of meal, even again for some of the offerings were not meat-based, which is what we're talking about at the beginning. Not all of them were meat. Most of them were, but some of them weren't. And it says, so Moses tells Aaron and his family to do this. And it says, they brought to the front of the tent of meeting the things that Moses had commanded. And the whole community came forward and stood before the Lord. So they did what they were supposed to do, and the community comes out for this as well. Moses said, this is what the Lord has commanded that you do, that the presence of the Lord may appear to you. Directions for the priests. Then Moses said to Aaron, come forward to the altar and sacrifice your sin offering and your burnt offering, making expiation for yourself and for the people, and sacrifice the people's offering and make expiation for them as the Lord had commanded. So Moses tells Aaron, come forward and do this stuff. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that we already know that Aaron and his family are supposed to be doing these offerings. We've already heard that. But it seems as though now that Aaron is actually open for business with the altar here and the sacrifices, that Aaron is hesitant. Why do we say that? Because Moses says, come forward to the altar. And the rabbis actually pick up on this language, the insinuation here perhaps, that Aaron, when he's now finally going to be taking on the responsibility from this day forth to do these offerings. Because remember, Moses kind of inaugurated it. Moses kind of kicked it off. The first stuff is kind of done by Moses. He's the one who inaugurates the priests. He's the one who ordains them. He's the one who gets this thing going. But now that Aaron's now going to be in charge, maybe Aaron is a little hesitant. Because up until this time, Moses has been with him the whole time. And really the only time he was on his own was the golden calf situation. So what is it now that makes Aaron a little hesitant? Is it the fact that now he's kind of on his own? Him and his family are now the ones in charge. It's not Moses anymore. From this point on, it's him. Interestingly, there's actually something that the rabbis point out that actually kind of triggers this in Aaron's head. It doesn't say it in the text, but they extrapolate. We know, those of us who've read this already the last few weeks, that the altar is very interesting. It's not just a flat thing. On the altar, there's corners, there's horns to the altar, right? Karnav, there's horns on the four corners. And the rabbis tell us that when Aaron sees those four corners, he sees those horns sticking up, he thinks of the golden calf. The horns remind him of the calf. And all of a sudden, he's feeling very, very humiliated. And so he wonders to himself, am I up for this? Am I up for the task? And so Moses has to say, come on, come forward. And it says that Aaron then does come forward to the altar and slaughtered his calf of sin offering. Aaron's sons brought the blood to him. He dipped his finger in the blood and put it on the horns of the altar, and he poured out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. It's exactly what he was supposed to do. Everything he's following is exactly what he was supposed to do. The fat, the kidneys, the protuberance of the liver from the sin offering, he turned it into smoke on the altar, as the Lord had commanded Moses. And the flesh and the skin were consumed in the fire outside the camp. So it's not necessarily the thing we should read, Jamie, when we're talking about being vegetarian, but why we, again, they were doing it on God's command, and we'll see what happens when they deviate a little bit. Then he slaughtered the burnt offering. Aaron's sons passed the blood to him, and he dashed it against all the sides of the altar. Exactly what he was supposed to do. They passed the burnt offering to him in sections, as well as the head, and he turned it into smoke on the altar. He washed the entrails and the legs and turned them into smoke on the altar with the burnt offering. Next, he brought forward the people's offering. He took the goat for the people's sin offering, and he slaughtered it and presented it as a sin offering like the previous one. And he brought forward the burnt offering, and he sacrificed it according to regulation. So he brings up the sin offering for himself and his family. He brings up the sin offering for the people, takes care of the people exactly as he's supposed to do it. And now he's bringing up the offerings that are the other offerings on behalf of the community. He brings forward the burnt offering and sacrifices according to regulation. He brought forward the meal offering, and taking a handful of it, he turned to smoke on the altar, in addition to the burnt offering of the morning, which is the daily sacrifice. He slaughtered the ox and the ram, the people's sacrifice of well-being. Aaron's sons passed the blood to him, which he dashed against the side of every side of the altar. And the fat parts of the ox and the ram, the broad tail, the covering fat, the kidneys and the protuberance on their livers, they laid these fat parts over the breasts, and Aaron turned the fat parts into smoke on the altar. And elevated the breasts and the right thighs as an elevation offering before the Lord, as Moses had commanded. And Aaron lifted his hands towards the people, and he blessed them. And he stepped down after offering the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the offering of well-being. So Aaron does all the sacrifices. He does exactly what he's supposed to do as God commanded. And then it says he lifted his hands towards the people and he blessed them. And he stepped down after that. So he blesses them and does something in addition after he does the sacrifices. Now, we learn later that there's a blessing. We learn in the book of Numbers that there's a blessing that Aaron is supposed to say, literally the line, the threefold blessing, right? You have Arecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, may the Lord bless you and keep you. At this point, we don't know exactly what that blessing is. Is it that blessing already? Well, the rabbis like to say that, yes, he knew the blessing. God inspired him with the blessing, and that he blesses the people here with this threefold blessing, the Birkat Kohanim, the blessing of the priests. But he blesses them in addition to offering up the sacrifices. Moses and Aaron then went inside the tent of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the presence of the Lord appeared to all the people. So now Moses and Aaron enter into the tent, which is the part that now people can't see him. When he was outside in the altar, all the people can see him. When Moses and Aaron go into the tent of meeting, they can't be seen. When they come out, though, it says they bless the people, which means that Moses and Aaron together bless them. And then it says the presence of the Lord appeared to all the people, which means that up until that time, whatever they were seeing, which again, we know they saw the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, but now they see something extra. They see this kavod Adonai. And that's the phrase we have right there, the kavod Adonai, that all the people would see now the presence of the Lord, which is some physical manifestation of God that people don't normally see. So this is used in the Bible to kind of denote a special presence of God. It's not really translated beyond kavod as presence. The word, obviously, the root of it, kavod, like kaved et avicha ve'et imecha, means to honor, right? That's to honor. So the root of it is honor or holiness, something of weight, something of substance. is also in the root for kaved. And so this manifestation of God, the people see, and it's not all of God. It's not, I mean, even Moses doesn't get to see all of God, but it's some piece of God that people up until that time really haven't seen. Or
They
again,
only saw the pillar of fire and the cloud.
yes. And
Okay,
again,
so those are the two things, and the fire behind the burning bush.
and well, only Moses saw that, but remember, they did get to see God's presence at Mount Sinai. So that is a presence that they saw that is significant, and then we read about it we read about it in Exodus. And what's interesting here, of course, is that as the people, I mean, we also should say that it's not just the sacrifices that bring God down, it's also Moses and Aaron blessing the people, which brings God's presence to them. But it says, fire came forth from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat parts on the altar. And all the people saw and shouted and fell on their faces. So it's not just that they offered up sacrifices, but that there was a fire that came from God and consumes the offerings. At least, again, this first public offering of the first day of business, if you will. So people see that God is present at this sacrifice, right? So God is acknowledging and taking part in the sacrifice. And the people saw it and they react to it. They shout, they fall down on their faces. And so their reaction is one of humility. It's also an act of maybe fear, but they definitely react to it. It's not just that they saw it, but they also react to it. And so they see, and of course, we're supposed to take away from this, that these sacrifices, when they're done right, bring God into our presence. And this is very important for the priests to convey this to the people, which is that if these things are done right, if we do our job and you support us in our job, of course, if you bring the sacrifices and if you do the things the way we're supposed to do them, God actually comes down and is part of the offering. So needless to say, this is something that, hey, let's do it right. Because when we do it right, we'll actually see God, which is what people want. They want to be close to God. They want to see God. They want God to be active and responsive. And so, of course, they respond to it, but they want God to respond to it. The sacrifices aren't there to kill animals. They're there to bring God into their midst.
It's like proof of God's existence and his watching over them. It's proof.
It's proof. And of course, it's proof that the priests are doing God's work. And it's proof that if the system is working, if everyone's doing their part, if you're bringing the sacrifices, if we're offering them right, if God's happy, then we're all going to know it. And so this is like, it's working. It's working. This is the way it's supposed to be. And now chapter 10 comes along. And here we go. Now Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took his fire pan and put fire in it. And they laid incense on it, and they offered before the Lord alien fire, which he had not enjoined upon them. It's critical that one verse is all we know about Nadav and Avihu, what they did, why it was bad. The word Aish Zara is translated usually as alien, foreign, something that is not yours, not your way, not something you're supposed to do. It's what the other peoples do. They offered it. And again, we don't know anything else about Nadav and Avihu other than they're the two older sons that Aaron has. He has four sons, Nadav, Avihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar and Eleazar. Those are the four sons of Aaron. And That's all we learned about who they are, what they did. And the only thing we know about it being bad is that it's an alien fire. Because the next verse is, the fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them. Thus they died at the instance of the Lord. That's it. That's the story. Now, needless to say, it opens up lots of questions. I mean, when people talk about this Torah portion, they talk about these two lines. I mean, there's other stuff we're about to see. There's more in this portion that's really, really important. But this is pretty much the only narrative we have in the whole book of Leviticus, and it's not good. It's very troubling, but it's also very cryptic. What happens here? We're only seeing like a sketch of it, because we don't really know what happened and why it happened. And was this an act of idolatry? Was this an act of haughtiness, of ego? Was it an act of stupidity? We don't know. And it leads people to kind of want to speculate what happens. Now, part of the tradition on this is what happened, what went wrong, is that Nadav and Avihu actually were drunk when they did this. Why? Because we're going to read right after this that the priests are not supposed to drink when they're offering up sacrifices. When they're working, they're not supposed to drink. We'll see that in a second. So we'll touch on that again. But the scene here thus far is so limited in description that, again, we just keep coming up with, well, maybe it was this, maybe this is why they did it. Maybe it wasn't so much that they did it with contempt or with ego. Maybe they just didn't do what they were supposed to do, and so God has to teach them a lesson. I mean, we go so far as the people say, well, they're punished completely out of proportion to their crime, which is why some people say, well, this is Aaron finally getting paid back for the golden calf incident, which is crazy, because punish Aaron, don't punish his sons. Some would argue, well, there's nothing worse than losing your son, so Aaron gets really badly punished. If he had died, it wouldn't have been as painful as this. I mean, those are the crazy, to some extent, explanations for a horrible thing that we just don't have any information about. We don't have much more to go on. We have nothing more to go on other than what the Midrash and the sages say about this over the centuries. And we're always saying something new, because we're always searching for answers. We're always trying to figure out, what did Nadav and Avihu do that was so bad that they warranted immediate death, and very violent and very public? Because assumedly, this comes in front of everybody.
What was interesting, though, is what came before. The instructions for what to do and who was to do it were so clear, so precise. You take this, you put it here, you take the blood and you splash it here, and you do this and you do that. It was sentence after sentence of exactly what to do, and this comes out of nowhere.
Yeah. And so yes, the context
You
of,
gotta look at the whole context, because there's pages and pages of directions, and then all of a sudden, an act that doesn't follow any of the directions.
Yeah. So this is it's definitely a cautionary tale for the priests. That two of your ancestors, they messed up big time, and there wasn't a whole lot of wiggle room. I mean, one thing we could say is that the priests are basically being told here, you got a tremendous honor, tremendous responsibility with this power, with this wonderful powers and wealth that you get. You also are taking on this responsibility that has a commensurate punishment when you deviate and go wrong. So
Rabbi, didn't we also hear a while back about the incense, and that it was special, it was sacred, and not anybody was supposed to touch the incense?
Yep. Which is exactly why, great point, is exactly why
Good memory.
we don't mess around with incense today. It's one of the reasons why, Jews get a little weird about incense, about recreating the incense of the priests, because,
Don't want to do it wrong.
if you take out one thing and you don't quite do it, does that become alien fire? And now, you get burned up. Now, look, you and I would say, well, if we try to recreate the incense and make our own incense, priestly incense at home, we're not offering it to God, or I would say most of us would say we're not trying. Most of us wouldn't do it to try to offer it to God. We'd do it maybe as an exercise. And well, let me put it this way. There are places in Israel you can go to, gift stores, where you can buy holy water from the Jordan River and oil from wherever, and you can get the incense of the temple. There's people who've marketed it or put it in a box, but we don't know the mix, and we don't know the exact ingredients and the measurements. But because the punishment is so severe, as you point out, hey, people are like, no, we shouldn't even mess around with it. We shouldn't even try to do this, because look what happened to them. And yeah, let's stay away from the incense.
So it ended up an example for the ages.
Yeah, it
Not
did.
for those people. It's still an example that we're listening to now.
Yep. And people do take this incense stuff seriously. And I would say it's not just the incense, but it's one of the reasons why people have been very careful not to. Well, look, we've talked about this before. We can't reinstitute a sacrificial, we can't reinstitute the sacrifices because we don't have access to the Temple Mount. So we can't offer up sacrifices at the Dome of the Rock where the temple once stood. But one of the reasons why people are so hesitant to even touch it, and one of the reasons why even the Orthodox are saying, you know what, we'll leave it alone. We won't try, we won't, because Israel has had the power and the ability to, again, people say it's going to start World War III. Well, look, it's definitely going to be provocative, whatever. It could start World War III, whatever. I'm not dismissing that. But one of the reasons why Israel hasn't even touched it is because even if we removed the Dome of the Rock, right? Even if we risked war and everything else, moved, destroyed it, whatever, created that space, then the question would be, okay, so then how do we do it? We've talked about the red heifer and the fact that you'd have to find this red heifer and rededicate. And as we said, the priest can't come into contact with any dead person. And so the priest would have to be raised from childhood, never coming into contact with death. All of these things would have to go into the mix, right? And be taken into consideration. And then if we do all that stuff, if we do risk the war and get the priests and get the make the garments the way we read about it in Exodus a few weeks ago, make the ephod and you make all the things, then you're like, but if we do it like a little bit wrong, we wind up dead like Nadav and Avihu. So at the end of the story,
Powerful lesson.
yeah. And if you get to that point, right? So if you do all the stuff and you get to that point and then you do it wrong, you blow up. So people are like, you know what? Let's not do it. Let's wait for God to reinstitute this, because there are some Jews and there are some Christians who say, you know what? Maybe we're supposed to do it. Maybe God's given us the access to the temple. God has God has provided for so many things for us to be able to do it, that maybe God is wanting us to do it. So there is that stream as well. But then we always fall back on Torah observant Jews who say, but look what happens if we don't do it to the letter of the law. We don't want to be like Nadav and Avihu. So this is very, very, and this isn't the only instance of it. For those who remember other parts of the Bible, there's this horrible instance in the book of Samuel where the ark is coming back into Jerusalem and it falls off a wagon, and a guy runs over to try to stop it, and he gets killed for trying to grab it from falling off the wagon. He's not doing anything wrong. He's just trying to stop it from falling on the ground, but he touched it. He wasn't supposed to touch it. And so he dies, and it freaks everybody out. And I'm just telling you, as weird as the story is, it must have happened, because the way the Torah tells it,
Right.
it seems as though, oh my God, that really happened. That freaked everybody out. So there is this fear, and this is the kind of the message from this, is that when you're opening up this power, when you're opening up this area, this is what Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory, his commentary this week for Shmini is that this is very much like nuclear power, right? It's very powerful, right? It's a very powerful and can be a very helpful type of energy, but it's also extremely dangerous. And so it is both extremely, the potential is amazing. I mean, we know that, but again, are we risking huge damage by opening this up? And so there is that both kind of desire to accumulate this power, to access this power, but there's also this fear and innate knowledge that this is also could be extremely destructive. And I think we know that about science. I mean, we know that about not just nuclear science, but we know that about genetic engineering. We know that about, creation of viruses. I mean, we know that we have tremendous capabilities, but there's also, with a little bit of a mistake here or there, or somebody being, not exceptionally careful, we can let loose, terrible destruction on people, biological, weapons that could just, be horrendous. So
There's one other factor. This was done, and it was calling down the Lord. And the Lord, my guess, didn't want to be called down this week and that week and the other week by anybody who made up a ceremony, who changed the ceremony and were acting in a way to bring down the Lord, and they did it wrong. And you don't want to keep calling the Lord all the time.
Yep. And so again, this is another good point to think about, consider, as Joyce offers it up, is if you're not following the directions and we're dealing with God, then we are putting ourselves at tremendous risk.
Tremendous risk.
And again, to think about
What the rock is?
modern analogies or modern examples of this. Again, there are potential cures or potential ways for us to heal that could potentially also destroy us. I mean, we know that. I mean, we know that, people use radiation therapy for cancer treatment, but we also know that if we do it too much, or if we do it it's done. It's very scary, because when you hear those kinds of things, I know people who've had prostate treatments, and it basically, they tell you if you go down this route of treatments, you can do it, but if you do it and it doesn't, and eventually it comes back, then you've made yourself you can't do these things anymore. And so there are analogies to this in our world where you got to be very careful what we do, because there are consequences to opening those things up. And they can be detrimental to us, even as we're trying to use them for good. Because again, there's no inclination here that Nadav and Avihu are even doing this for their own benefit. I mean, some people have taken that God knew that they were not doing it for the best of the people, but it doesn't say that. It doesn't even mean that. It doesn't mean that there's nothing here that says that they did it for a bad reason. And so this is where, again, Joyce's point is that, there's a certain responsibility that they had as priests, and they, by trying to initiate this communication with God, they're destroying the ability for God to be there when the appointed time is supposed to be. So it is a very interesting, lesson, a terrible lesson for the priests, for the priests to have to think about, about how they're ministering to their people. But definitely, I think a cautionary tale to priests to say, you better not get out of line. You better not, even if your motivations are good, you better follow the rules, because God is not forgiving, when people deviate. This is all we have of.
Can you tell me what the Dome of the Rock is?
It's the mosque that the Muslims, it's the golden dome that you see in Jerusalem in all the pictures, right? So that's kind of the most famous landscape, if you will, of Jerusalem, but it's actually a Muslim shrine, a Muslim holy place that's built on top of our holy place, which is the temple, where the temple once stood, the Temple of Solomon. And that temple was a holy place for the Jews for 1,000 years. And when the Muslims took control of it about 1,000 years later, they built their mosque there. And then, it's been a holy place for Muslims, and some people say it's the third holiest place in Islam. The reality, of course, is that they have a holy place, and they have a couple holy places in Saudi Arabia. Those are the pilgrimage sites. Jerusalem is not an official pilgrimage site in Islam.
Right.
It's a place that Muslims have to go. So, they call it the third holiest place because it's not the holy places. So, it's a little misleading, because again, it was not an Islamic holy place until they took control of it. And again, according to what we know in history, Muhammad never stepped foot in Jerusalem.
Right.
All the holy places of Islam are places that Muhammad went to. And again, the reality is Israel has to deal with this, but the holy place, the holy site, is maintained by Muslims under Israel's authority. Israel has let them run that place for the last 73 years. And Israel has allowed the Muslim authority to be in charge of that Temple Mount.
Nice.
So it is a place that Jews can sometimes visit, but not always. Sometimes it's shut because there's conflict, and there's situations where tourists aren't allowed up on the Temple Mount. So, all right. So the next line after this horrible situation, the last thing we read is they get destroyed. God destroys them. And it says, then Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord meant when he said, through those near to me, I will show myself holy and gain glory before all the people. And Aaron was silent. And the word in Hebrew, it's only one word. It's vayidom Aharon. So it's usually translated as silent. Of course, in Hebrew, dom, vayidom, almost sounds like dumbfounded, that he is without words. And he is, again, to say the least, speechless. His sons just died in front of him, in front of everybody. And he can't say anything. Now, remember, Aaron is the spokesman of Moses. Aaron was the one who could speak because Moses couldn't speak. And so now he can't say anything. And Moses's job here in telling Aaron, this is why this is so serious. Moses is, and remember, these are Moses's nephews. They're not just Aaron's sons, they're Moses's family too.
Mhm.
And he just watched this happen as well. This is it. This is all Moses says to Aaron, and Aaron doesn't say a word. And there is no more words from him regarding this. It's not like you're going to see him say, but my sons died in the last war. He doesn't say more. There is nothing that he says about this. So again, Aaron, the spokesperson for Moses, the one who speaks to the people for Moses, has nothing to say. And now, how do we move forward? How do we deal with what to do now? Because half of Aaron's family, or Aaron's sons, the next priests, half of them just died. 50% of the Kohanim are destroyed in an instant. And again, think about that for a second, because we do know that this has been verified, as we've talked about numerous times, by genetics. All the Kohanim that we have in the world, all the people who trace their ancestry back to these sons of Aaron, right? The Cohens, the Katzes, Kaplans, all the people with those kinds of names that are Kohanim, Kohanic names, Khan, all those people, there's only half as many as they're supposed to be, because half of the Kohanim just got destroyed. Gone. Now, again, maybe they already had sons, maybe they already had multiplied, but maybe not. Maybe, again, half of the priests of the world were destroyed in the moment, and all of their descendants. So, what to do now? So it says Moses, the Torah tells us that Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, sons of Uzziel, the uncle of Aaron, also, of course, his uncle, and said to them, come forward and carry your kinsmen away from the front of the sanctuary to a place outside of camp. So that's his direction to fellow Levites, not Kohanim, because they're not from Aaron's immediate family. They're not Aaron's descendants. They're Aaron's ancestors, if you will. They're his cousins. They are his relations. They're Levites, but they're not priests, because if the priests come into contact with the dead bodies now, they're not going to be able to be priests anymore. This is kind of what we learn about from the priests, is why Kohanim are not allowed to go into cemeteries. They're not allowed to come into contact with death. So this is a pretty serious situation. It's a very horrific situation, but now they have to figure out what to do. And it says they came forward and carried them out of the camp by their tunics, as Moses had ordered. And Moses said to Aaron and to his sons Eleazar and Itamar, do not bare your heads and do not rend your clothes, lest you die in anger strike the whole community. But your kinsmen, all the house of Israel, shall bewail the burning that the Lord has wrought. And so do not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting, lest you die, for the Lord's anointing oil is upon you. And they did as Moses had bidden. And so this is what we're also left with, is that the priests also, at this point, can't even take part in the mourning rituals. They're not able to fully mourn their own brothers because of the situation of what they are at this moment, which is anointed priests. They are people who have literally come into contact with the Holy One. And they're not allowed to be like a normal person. And it's terrible, because it's their brothers that died. They lost two brothers. and they're not allowed to mourn. So these are the things that, again, people did as mourning. They would bare their heads. They would rend their clothes, tear their clothes. We still do that. So we can see these rituals that people did even in this period of time over 3,000 years ago. So not only are they heartbroken, but they can't express it. Now, it doesn't say exactly that God told them that, but Moses seems to know that they can't do it. Now, again, is it God had told them that? Torah doesn't say that. The Torah says they did as Moses had bidden, not what God had bidden. But it seems that Moses is protecting them or trying to protect them. Because I think at this point, Moses is saying, we just made a mistake. And let's not anchor God further. Let's be very careful with what we do right now. Because we have just opened up this tremendous power. And we don't want to upset God, and we don't want to do anything that might trigger more death. And so I think what we see here is this feeling of uncertainty of, what do we do now? Let's be very cautious. Let's be overly cautious, if you will, because we don't want to have this happen. And again, it's a cautionary tale for the priests, but it's a cautionary tale for humanity. And we think about it all the time ourselves. And as a matter of fact, one can make the argument we're thinking about it tremendously right now. Because again, we don't want to see people go backwards and go back to a point of saying, hey, look, let's do everything we can to protect everybody. But of course, in some cases, we're being told to do things that, again, we don't know whether they're what we're supposed to do. People are so traumatized and so scared that they're doing whatever they can do to try to prevent death from happening. And it's a natural human reaction. We don't know that God wanted them not to be sad. We don't know that. We don't know that. God doesn't say, don't be sad, Aaron. Doesn't say, Eleazar and Itamar, you can't mourn. But Moses seems to think they're not supposed to. And we take away from it, again, that priests have to be very, very careful when they come into contact with death, to avoid death in all cases. But again, it's the human reaction to being scared, to coming in contact with death, and to try to figure out, well, what do we do now? And then, of course, sometimes people overreact. It's a natural human tendency because we're scared. The Lord now says, now God does speak. So if you were going to say, well, wouldn't God tell Moses what to do now? Maybe he wouldn't talk to Aaron. No, he talks to him. He talks to him right now. So if God wanted Aaron and his sons not to mourn, why does he say it? Moses said it. And of course, what he does say is this: drink no wine or other intoxicants, you and your sons, when you enter the tent of meeting, that you may not die. This is a law for all time throughout the ages. For you must distinguish between the sacred and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, and you must teach the Israelites all the laws which the Lord has imparted to them through Moses. So your job is to teach people. Your job is to decide what is kosher and what's not kosher. Your job is to do the right thing when it comes time to offer up sacrifices. And so you have to be able to be completely focused and not compromised at all by alcohol. Or it says other intoxicant, which of course would mean other types of drugs, which they had. It's not just drugs. It's not just alcohol. It's also drugs. Or again, something that could render you incapable of being able to do your job. So this is where we get this understanding that Nadav and Avihu were drinking, or drunk, or under the influence when they do this. It doesn't say it, but because of the next lines from God, that's why we take it away. Now, again, doesn't say it, but the context led people for years to take this away. And I'm not saying like it's a new interpretation. It's an interpretation in the Talmud. It's an interpretation in the Midrash. It is traditional Jewish understanding that Nadav and Avihu must have been intoxicated when they went in. Look, the rabbis derived from this that they also had to be careful when they did their jobs. And they would not drink when they would do their jobs, which were to adjudicate decisions that people would present to them when they were doing which was primarily what the rabbis did, which was to try to figure out how to teach, how to instruct the people, which is what they do after the priests are done. Once there's no more priesthood, it's left to the rabbis to teach the Israelites all the laws which the Lord has commanded them through Moses. So they saw themselves, the rabbis saw themselves as the inheritors of this job from the priests. Now they have to do it. And because they have to do it, and they have to do it the way the priests have to do it, they're not supposed to drink any wine or intoxicate or be intoxicated. So Judaism is interesting, and I'm saying this to you, as I already told many of you if you joined late. I'm in Utah right now, which is the one state in the United States where you still can't buy alcohol anywhere you want. They're very strict about it. You have to go to a liquor store, a state-run liquor store, in order to buy intoxicants. You can get, or liquors, you can get beer and wine at the grocery store, but you can't get alcohol. You also have to go to certain bars in order to get alcohol, or go to a bar to get alcohol. But they have very interesting laws about how they can serve and how they serve alcohol, even in those bars. I will tell you, I remember coming here as a kid. You couldn't even, kid. An adult couldn't drink alcohol in Utah unless they were a member of a club. And so people would join, when they go to a restaurant, they'd join a club for the evening. It was a loophole. It was like almost like a Jewish loophole, legal fiction that allowed people to drink in Utah because they couldn't drink in bars. There were no restaurants that you could drink in. There were no bars that you could drink in. So you had to join clubs, and that was your way around the Utah blue laws, if you will. So Utah's pretty strict still, even for a state when it comes to alcohol, because again, in Utah, they believe in the Mormon tradition, which is still the predominant religion in the state, that essentially all of their men are priests. They're all elders within their community. And so alcohol would definitely lead them down this path of rendering decisions in an intoxicated way. Look, it was a big issue for centuries in America, for a good first 150, almost 200 years of our history. Alcohol was a lightning rod issue in our country. And you know that because, again, up until right after World War I, we had various phases of prohibition. And it wasn't just, the Volstead Act. There were other times and other places where states or locales would come up with laws against alcohol, because alcoholism was in some cases a rampant problem in our country. And so this was a big issue in our country for a very politically divisive issue, which touched on temperance laws for early suffrage. It was connected to literally women voting. All of these things touched on. It touched on abolition. It touched on there was not just one area that alcohol, the politics of alcohol, and it's because we recognize that alcohol is a mood altering substance which can affect the way people live their lives, and in many cases exercise the most important functions of their lives, their work, their religious duties. And so in order to keep people safe, people went to those, in some cases, very extreme measures, which of course, as we know, don't oftentimes fix the problem. They accelerate the problems. That being said, I've mentioned this before, and I mention it every year or every time we've ever studied this portion. I never drink alcohol before services or before classes or during classes or when we're engaged in study or prayer. Of course, the exceptions being Purim and Simchat Torah, when we're supposed to drink during those times. But other than that, I never do. I mean, as I told you before, I had a not very delicious veggie burger before class. Fries were pretty good, but the veggie burger, as I said, was not very good. But it would have been a beautiful time to also have a beer with that. Maybe not. I don't drink every day, but there's certain meals where I would have said that would have been a good place to have a beer. But I wouldn't, because we're going into class right afterwards. So I don't drink alcohol before class or before services. So I don't drink wine at Shabbat before I go to synagogue. I just don't. I never have. And I'll drink grape juice even for Kiddush on Friday nights. So I take it seriously. And again, it's not that I never drink alcohol. That's not the case. But when I'm doing certain things, I won't drink at all. And for that matter, I should also say I won't take any kind of narcotic or any type of pain reliever or anything else that would maybe affect my mental state. So we take it seriously. I mean, I think we try to take it seriously in Judaism. And again, there are cases where rabbis have been addicted and actually not just addicted, but actually being under the influence at certain times. And those are, I wouldn't say fireable offenses. I guess it's up to the community, but they're serious offenses. I mean, it's a serious mistake and one that could lead to rabbi being terminated. And it's based on this scene, folks, which is that you have a responsibility to be at your to have mental clarity and to be at your best mentally without any type of any kind of intoxication when you're doing something holy. And hopefully you don't need it. Hopefully you actually don't need to have that, because the experience of being in God's presence and doing important stuff will be enough of a elevation so that you won't need to have any foreign substances. So there you have it. There's my little teaching on this very, very interesting text, which again, Judaism does not prohibit alcohol, or to some extent, and people have argued this before, doesn't prohibit legal substances to be used. Again, I say legal substances because Jewish law is also very clear that we're not allowed to break the law of our country, right? So the law of the land is our law too. So we can't just say, well, I follow Jewish law. I don't follow the law of Massachusetts or the law of California. You've got to follow the law. So if the law says that this is a prohibited substance, you can't use it. You can't say, well, Jewish law doesn't say it's prohibited. No, there are other laws that we have to uphold. That being said, there are also times and places for that. And this is a very important teaching from today's portion. Arguably more relevant than the earlier story of Nadav and Avihu, because we're not offering up sacrifices. We're not doing that work. But it says right here, we are teaching. We are learning the laws which God imparted to all of us. And that's what we're doing right now. So that being said, I'm completely sober. I cannot blame anything that I'm going to say on any type of substance. Everything that you're hearing comes from a relatively clear mind, I guess. for whatever that's worth. But again, there's a time and place for it, which I think Judaism understands, that people have to be responsible. They have to know the time and place for certain behaviors. And again, we're not teetotaling. We're not telling people you can't. We're also, of course, telling people to be responsible and to understand the times and places for it. And also, again, that you have to be responsible for yourself. You have to be responsible. So now Moses spoke to Aaron and to Aaron's remaining sons, Eleazar and Ithamar. Take the meal offering that is left over from the Lord's offering by fire and eat it unleavened beside the altar, for it is most holy. You shall eat it in the sacred precinct, inasmuch as it is your due, and that of your children, from the Lord's offering by fire, for so I have been commanded. So he tells them, eat the meal offering. But the breast of elevation offering and the thigh of gift offering, you and your sons and daughters with you, you may eat in any clean place, for they have been assigned as a due to you and your children from the Israelite sacrifices of well-being. Now, you're also allowed to eat these other offerings, these pieces of these other sacrifices. You're allowed to eat them. And those you can take home with you. Those you can eat outside of the Temple Mount. The meal offering, that you have to eat inside the area, the assigned area, the Mishkan, and then later on the temple. But you can take the meat home with you in a doggy bag, if you will. This is the first doggy bag that we have in Judaism, which is not a Jewish law, but definitely something that the Jewish people are very familiar with, taking home doggy bag. But in reality, of course, this is not a doggy bag. This is seriously for the people. This is for the priests to eat. This is something that they got to enjoy. It's their due. Together with the fat of fire offering, they must present the thigh of gift offering and the breast of elevation offering, which are to be elevated as an elevation offering before the Lord, and which are to be your due and that of your children with you for all time, as the Lord had commanded. Then Moses inquired about the goat of sin offering, and it had already been burned. He was angry with Eleazar and Ithamar, Aaron's remaining son, and said, why did you not eat the sin offering in the sacred area? For it is most holy, and he has given it to you to remove the guilt of the community and to make expiation for them before the Lord. Since its blood was not brought inside the sanctuary, you should just certainly have eaten it in the sanctuary, as I commanded. So this Moses is a little upset that they didn't do with the goat offering what they were supposed to do. And Aaron spoke to Moses and said, see this day, they brought their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord, and such things have befallen me. Had I eaten sin offering today, would the Lord have approved? And so Aaron's challenge to Moses is, look, I didn't think we were supposed to eat this stuff today, because look what just happened. So I wouldn't have thought that God wanted us to do this like this today, because we already screwed up. My other two sons screwed up, and I figured maybe we're not supposed to eat it. Now it's a logical conclusion. And it says when Moses heard this, he approved. So Moses' instinct is to follow the letter of the law. And God said, you do this, you do this. And you see what happens if you don't do it. You get burnt up. And so Moses has taken the line of, maybe Aaron, you just follow directions today. And Aaron's counter to him is, but this isn't, we went off the rails today, Moses. Look what happened to my sons today. I just wanted to get it out, get it over. I didn't worry about taking stuff home with me today. It's already been done. I didn't want to take a chance. And so I just figured I'd offer it all up. And so when Aaron explains this to him, Moses understands, and it says that Moses approved. Now, what's interesting, of course, is we don't hear what God says about it, but it must have been okay for God, because God doesn't do anything else that day. God's done. And we now the scene is over, but we actually come back to it. And so when we come back in 5 chapters from now, so it's not this week, rest of this week, and not next week. Next week, we read a double portion of Tazria and Matzorah, which is about skin diseases. But when we come back to it in a couple weeks, in Achrei Mot means after the death of Nadav and Avihu. We do come back to this and what happens now. But we kind of now go into some of the laws. We now deviate away. We step away from this scene. We're now out of this scene. And what's interesting is what we get now. What do we get in the rest of Parshat Shmini? Well, we get an opening line, which is similar to many other lines in the Torah. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe v'Aaron lehemor. God spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, Alehem, spoke to them, saying, speak to the Israelite people thus. Dibru el b'nei Yisrael lehemor. Also very common. But now we get back to meat, Jamie. Now we get to the meat. We get to the meat. And this is the rest of Shmini, which is the laws of Kashrut, the laws of the animals that we can eat. And what's interesting here is that we just read that one of the things that Aaron and his sons have to do is they have to distinguish between the sacred and the profane, between the unclean and the clean. Ben kodesh uvein hachol, ben hatameh uvein hatahor. And now we're going to get to those clean and unclean animals. These are the creatures that you can eat from among the land animals. The first category, because remember, the animals we're about to read, for those who either haven't read this or might have forgotten, they're not classified by their species, by their genus or order, etc. Nope. This is all about where they live, what their regions are. And there's 3 classifications: land, sea, and air. Those are the classifications, where you'll find them. Now, again, you could say, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not really how you know animals are kosher. But of course, it is important, because where you find an animal, at the end of the day, that's going to tell you, when you're eating it, what you need to know. Because it doesn't really matter whether the animal is a ruminant or an arthropod or nobody ever, when you're hungry, when you're out in a field somewhere and you're really, really hungry and need to eat something, you don't need a lecture on biology. You need to know, is this a food I can eat or I can't eat? What are the animals that I would see walking around that I can eat? I don't need to know what classification they are. That's great for biology class. It's great for science. It's not really important when you're hungry and when you need to eat or when you like to eat. The following, however, of those that either chew their cud or have true hoofs, you shall not eat. The camel, although it chews its cud, it has no true hoofs. Oh, I skipped a part here. So any animal that has true hoofs with clefts through the hoofs and that chew their cud, you can eat. So those 2 requirements: hoofs and chew their cud. And again, real true hoofs. And it says the following, however, do not have true hoofs. They are the camel, chews its cud, but it has no true hoofs. It's unclean for you. The damon, although it chews the cud and has no true hoofs, is unclean for you. And again, the damon is the shafan is a type of rabbit, type of hare, and you see them all over. You see them all over Israel, and they are really common creatures. They're all over the place, and it would be really good if you could eat them because they're everywhere. And if they're eating your crops, it surely would be nice to eat them. Because if anyone's ever had wild rabbits, hares going through their backyard and eating their vegetables, it's not fun. you'd like to at least say, you want to eat my food, I'm going to eat you. But you can't. You can't eat these varmints. You can't eat these hares and rabbits and little rock badgers, as they're called sometimes. You can't eat some of those things. Again, they're all everywhere, but can't eat them. And of course, here we get to Hazir. The Khazir, the swine. And this is the tricky one because he has true hooves. He has a split hoof with the hooves cleft through. Totally a split hoof. But it does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. And this is a very rare type of animal because from the outside, he's kosher. You have to go inside to see he's not kosher. So what's tricky about a pig is that you don't know from looking at him, which is why being a pig, we oftentimes say, of course, even in English, being a pig is not good because you're a pig, right? You're eating everything. It's a bad word or a derogatory word in, I don't know, is there a political correctness issue I said just now about pigs? I'm not even sure if I offended pigs of America now by saying it's a derogatory word, but it is a derogatory word in Judaism for a whole different reason. Had nothing to do with what they ate, had nothing to do with how they ate it. Though the rabbis did make fun of them for rolling around in their own filth and eating anything they wanted. It wasn't that. It was their trickery. It was their superficial, I'm okay, but really they're not okay. And so a Khazir is a negative in Judaism, not just because of their behavior of wallow, in their filth, but because according to the rabbis, they show you their hooves. They'll roll around on their back and they'll show your hooves like, I'm okay, but they're not okay. They trick you like that. But again, in Yiddish, we use the word Hazir as a derogatory word for someone who behaves like a pig. And so Khazir is not a good thing to call someone in Yiddish, but it's from Hebrew. It's the Hebrew word Khazir. That is the Hebrew word Khazir. And so this is not kosher. As many people have bewailed the fact that pigs aren't kosher. How could they, as my dad used to say, how could they not be kosher? They taste so good. They can't, there's no way they can't be kosher. They taste so good. I would just laugh at those discussions, but they weren't discussions. They were his view of Jewish law that he didn't agree with. They are not kosher. And again, other people speculate it's because pigs were susceptible to trichinosis, disease that was very common up until recently, even in spoiled pork. I remember too, my dad used to offer this teaching that pork chops, whole pork slices, those aren't kosher, but bacon is kosher. Somehow he said that pork isn't kosher. I guess because it wasn't a very Jewish thing to eat, or at least not in his family, but bacon was okay. But anyways, no, it's all not kosher. And what was interesting about it, of course, is that this was for within Judaism, this was one of the things that made Jewish law, when it came to diet and dietary requirements, very different from other peoples in the ancient world, and of course in the modern world as well. And so some people say that one of the reasons why, and again, there are other diets that have pork in them, other religious or cultural traditions that have pork, but the ones that don't have pork, generally Jews have felt more comfortable in those kind of communities because, again, there weren't the same dietary restrictions or prohibitions that Jews would then become affected by. And of course, in Islam, pork is not kosher as well. There the other animals, the other animals in Islamic law are kosher, or not kosher, they're halal, or they're acceptable. So Judaism also forbids, as you just read, the hare, camels. Camels are acceptable in Middle Eastern Arab diets. And so that was an example of a difference, a deviation. And of course, seafood, for example, is also acceptable in Islam, and it's not, as we're going to see, in Judaism. It says, you shall not eat of their flesh or touch their carcasses. They are unclean. The word again, tameh. These are unclean for you. Which again is why people got into this debate, whether they were acceptable, pig valves were acceptable for medical procedures. And most rabbis have ruled, of course, they're acceptable, because in order to save a life, you're allowed to pretty much do anything, including violate laws of Kashrut. And so pig valves were deemed kosher and acceptable to save a life. So those are pretty simple for land animals. There aren't too many, there are not too many deviations that we need to explain. It's pretty much have to have those two things. So if you discovered an animal later, as long as it fell within those distinctions, then you're okay. You don't have to really worry that much about it. These are so then we go into the water. These you may eat of that live in the water. Anything in water, whether in the seas or in the streams, that has fins and scales, these you may eat as well. So again, two requirements: fins and scales. Those two things are required. So just like land animals need something, water animals need two things as well: fins and scales. And that goes for anywhere where you find them. So it doesn't matter whether it's fresh water or salt water, those two things. But anything in the seas or the streams that has no fins or scales, among all the swarming things of the water and among all the living creatures that are in the water, they are an abomination for you. Okay, so that's the word that's used. They are an abomination. So the word in Hebrew is sheketz. Sheketz, an abomination. And an abomination for you, they shall remain. You shall not eat of their flesh, and you shall abominate their carcasses. Everything in water that has no fins and scales shall be an abomination. And again, it says it 3 times. I mean, it's not like there's really anywhere to go from this. And again, in Hebrew, the words for fins, snapir, and for scales, kaskeset, which kind of is an onomatopoeia, kaskeset. So scales. Again, what was the fish that was kind of questioned? Swordfish, whether they had scales. Definitely have fins, but there was a real debate over whether swordfish had true scales. And so some rabbis voted for their being kosher, and some said, no, their scales are not true scales. So there was an ongoing debate over swordfish. But again, there are lots of sea creatures that don't have scales. Most that have fins do have scales. Most of the ones that don't have scales also don't have fins. So usually it's not that much of a problem. I mean, any of these kinds of sea arthropods, or any of these kinds of classifications of mollusks don't have fins and scales. What's interesting is that the animals that have fins but no scales, most of the ones that we think about are mammals, are sea mammals. And so what was very interesting about that is that whales, porpoises, dolphins are not kosher. What's interesting about that, and some people have pointed out, is that those are some of the most intelligent creatures on the planet. We've kind of known that for a long time. And it's interesting that these animals are, we wouldn't say of like the highest order of thinking, but I mean, we don't have to go into the details of it, but and when you used to be able to go to SeaWorld, you would know that you could see these even these killer whales, can be doing amazing things. And so we've used dolphins for help in navigation and for quite frankly, they've been trained in naval combat. So they're quite intelligent animals, and they're not kosher. You can't kill them, or at least for food, you can't kill them. So land and water. Now we're going to get to the skies. This is a little bit more complicated. There is no requirements. This one gets tougher. The following you shall abominate among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They're an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, and the black vulture, the kite, falcons of every variety, and all varieties of raven. The ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, hawks of every variety, the little owl, the cormorant, and the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, and the bustard, the stork, herons of every variety, the hoopoe, and the bat. Oh my goodness. Gosh, when we get to that part, that has a whole new meaning now. But people would say for years when we read this, who eats bats? I want to get into that now. My goodness, it says right in the Torah, you're not supposed to be eating bat. Now, of course, all these things that fly, they all have something in common. They eat anything. They'll eat anything. Anything. And so any animal that's a predatory animal, and here's what kind of gives away the secret here, which is that the animals that we are allowed to eat are on the lower levels. And again, I don't even know what's politically correct. Am I going to offend an animal by saying this? They're the lowest level of the food chain. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say that, but I'm going to say it anyways. Until the animals tell me I can't say this, these are lower level animals that do not eat other things for the most part that are animals. I know people are going to say, but some of the fish that are allowed eat other things. They eat fish or they'll eat living things. But generally speaking, the fish that are kosher, generally speaking, are not predatory fish. Shark are predatory fish. Dolphins are predatory fish. Generally speaking, the fish that we eat are not predatory. I know they'll eat the worm on your hook, and I know you're going to tell me that that's a predatory animal. But generally speaking, they eat plankton, they eat, which is, I know, a living thing, but they'll eat. I really don't want to offend anybody. And I'm a vegetarian. I just want to make everybody clear. I don't want to offend anyone who loves animals of all kinds. I do, but I do want to tell you that there seems to be a logic here, which is that the lower levels of animals that we'd be eating would only be eating grass or things that was not susceptible to contamination. The higher up we go, the more likely we are to eat something that's eaten something else that is also eaten something else. So the simpler we're eating, the healthier we're eating. And so there is a logic here, which some people say would lead us to have a healthier diet in the sense that we're removing layers of possible contamination or infection. I don't know. I will tell you that if someone went back in time to try to tell people how to eat healthy, and you couldn't talk about organisms, you couldn't talk about microorganisms and infections and viruses and all the things that you and I now know about, how would you tell people who didn't have microscopes and didn't understand these things how to eat healthy? This is about as good as you can make it. I don't know what to tell you other than this list of animals that we got 3,000 years ago has helped keep us alive. Again, I know people are going to say, but you can still get sick. Yes, you can. but you mitigate it as much as possible. And this mitigates it as much as possible. By removing the blood from the animal, which we also already read, you're mitigating these health problems as much as possible. So that the birds are tough because unless they're specifically tells us what we can eat, there's a little bit of a problem of whether that bird is a kosher bird. But generally speaking, any type of chicken, any type of fowl is going to be okay. It's going to be all right. It's going to be okay to eat. But the birds that are predatory birds that eat carrion flesh, like vultures and hawks, those are not kosher. So those are the birds. Next, we get into these other categories of even lower forms of animals on the food chain, which are insects. And also classified in that are things like lizards, snakes, things that are what we call creepy crawly things. All winged swarming things that walk on all fours shall be an abomination for you. Well, that seems pretty clear, except right away we get a but. But these you may eat among the winged swarming things that walk on fours. All that have above their feet jointed legs to leap with on the ground. Of these things you may eat the following: locusts of every kind, all varieties of bald locusts, cricket of every variety, and all varieties of grasshoppers. So there's a law. You can't eat insects, except for these insects. And again, many people have pointed out the reason that you can eat those kinds of insects are because those are the insects that are going to eat your crops. And if you have nothing left but locusts, you can eat the locusts as a protein source. We don't know, but that is a possibility because the animals that we just had as the exceptions to the rules are the things that would eat your crops. And again, but then it goes back. It says all the winged swarming things that have 4 legs shall be an abomination for you. So it goes back to that. And the following shall make you unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses shall be unclean until evening. And whoever carries the carcasses of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean till evening. So now it says, you don't touch these things. You don't touch them alive. You don't touch them carcass-wise. Every animal that has true hoofs, but without, and then we go back to the animals. Every animal that has true hoofs, but without clefts through the hoofs, or that does not chew cud, these are unclean for you. Whoever touches them shall be unclean. Also, all the animals that walk on paws, among those that walk on 4s, are unclean for you. Whoever touches their carcasses shall be unclean until evening. Now, again, can you touch these animals alive? Yes, because you can have a dog, you can have a cat, but once they're dead, you got a problem. Because maybe, again, so that you should never be thought of that you're eating them, they render you unclean when you come into contact with them when they're dead. Anyone who carries their carcasses shall wash his clothes and remain unclean until evening. They are unclean for you. The following shall be unclean for you among the things that swarm on the earth. So now, after that, we have this kind of tangent into touching these things, touching them. Now we go back into more things that aren't kosher. So this list are more of the creepy crawly things. This literally says these are things that swarm on the earth. Mole, the mouse, great lizards of every variety. And great lizards here probably means like alligators, crocodiles, those kinds of lizards that are bigger than just a lizard. Not that lizards are also not kosher, but you're going to see the gecko, the land crocodile. which seems to, again, maybe not be a crocodile as we know it, but again, these are lizards, maybe again, more like a Komodo dragon or those kinds of land lizards, sand lizards, and a chameleon, which technically, of course, some of these things are classified as amphibians, but they're lizards or animals that normally would crawl on the ground. Those are for you the unclean among the swarming things. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until evening. And anything on which any of them falls when dead shall be unclean, be it any article of wood or a cloth or a skin or a sack, any such article that can be put to use shall be dipped in water. It shall remain unclean until evening, and then it shall be clean. So also objects. And if any of those falls into an earthen vessel, everything inside it shall be unclean, and the vessel itself you shall break. So if it comes to something that can't really be washed, or that the impurity, you can wash a vessel, of course, but it's porous. And so in order for it to be, can't really be cleaned and dried the same way, you have to break it. As to any food that may be eaten, it shall be unclean if it came into contact with water. As to any liquid that may be drunk, it shall be unclean if it is inside any vessel. So this is a big issue, because if you have a vessel that's filled with grain, for example, or olive oil, I mean, it's not just solids. If it comes into contact with these animals, it's unclean. Well, this is a big issue, because you're throwing out valuable commodity, life-saving commodity. But again, Jewish tradition seems to understand that it's not a good idea to eat this stuff if it comes into contact with these animals. As to any food that may be eaten, it should be unclean, right? If it came in contact with water. So as to any liquid that may be drunk, it shall become unclean if it was inside any vessel. Everything on which the carcass of any of them falls shall be unclean. An oven or stove shall be smashed. They're unclean, and unclean they shall remain for you. This is a major issue. Actually, we've talked about this at other times. There's a very famous Talmudic discussion over an oven that comes into contact with the carcass of one of these unclean animals, assumingly like a mouse or a lizard. And this oven ends up, again, there's a discussion of whether it can be fixed or not, because it's not clear if it's an oven, if part of it can be essentially remade, destroyed and then remade. And the rabbis actually get in an argument, and one of the rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer, ends up being thrown out of the community because he was so argumentative over it. But it was a major issue, because if you have an oven and you have to break it, smash it, that's a huge impact on your cost of living and your cost of livelihood, not your cost of living on your business. So this is a big issue. And it is financially a serious issue. They're unclean, and unclean they shall remain for you. So again, you and I can now say our rabbinic ancestors 1,500 years ago, or 1,800 years ago, when they argued over the oven of Achnai, that's the famous discussion, the oven of Achnai. They didn't understand about disease. They didn't understand about bacteria the way we do, but they did know that people got sick. They saw people dying of things they couldn't see. And they knew that there was food that conveyed and that was a carrier of disease. And they did an amazing job at trying to preserve life, if you think about it. Now, it doesn't say that this is going to keep you alive. It says they're clean and unclean. I mean, I understand. But if you're going to try to tell people what to do, and you tell them that God wants you to do this, how else are they going to live? They have to know that it's serious. However, a spring or cistern in which the water is collected shall be clean, but whoever touches such a carcass, it shall be unclean. And it shall be unclean, right? So the person who fishes it out of the cistern. Now, this is a big issue because it's also a tremendous expense. If you told someone they could never use the spring or the well that they drew this unclean animal out of, that they could never use it again, every single water area would be unclean. But obviously, it's a problem. I mean, there's an understanding that this is dangerous if one of these carcasses gets into the water supply. Then it says, if a carcass falls upon seed grain that is to be sown, it is clean. Now that's very interesting because you'd think, wow, that's going to spread disease, but it doesn't. And it isn't, because by the time the plant is going to go through germination and growth, if it came into contact with a dead animal, by the time it grows, it's not going to be a problem anymore. It's not going to convey that illness anymore. But if water is put on the seed and any part of the carcass falls upon it, it shall be unclean for you. Which is interesting because it says it's not in the seed once it's sown, but if the water that you're putting on it has come into contact with the carcass, then you can't eat it. Which is interesting because by extrapolation, the water or the chemicals that we put on food can affect us. Not necessarily the grain coming into contact with it, but later on, if we pour water on it that could make us sick, yeah, that could get us sick. An animal that you may eat has died. Anyone who touches its carcass shall be unclean until evening. Anyone who eats of its carcass shall wash his clothes and remain unclean until evening. Anyone who carries its carcass shall wash his clothes and remain unclean until evening. So here we have this other now law of, well, what happens if you eat an animal that was not slaughtered in a kosher way? What happens if you come into contact with it again? You can wash yourself. You have to give it time, and then you can be okay. But you have to go through a period of washing and to some extent being away from everybody else, because you can spread that disease. So there's a time limit, there's a quarantining that goes through with this as well. And you're going to see that in the next Torah portion in Hazir and Masorah about quarantining and about keeping people away. And sometimes it's only for a few hours, but sometimes it's for weeks. All the things that swarm upon the earth are an abomination. They shall not be eaten. You shall not eat among all the things that swarm upon the earth, anything that crawls on its belly, or anything that walks on fours, or anything that has many legs, for they are an abomination. So that goes for spiders, ants, all those types of creatures that are insects, not necessarily part of the insect family, arthropods, spiders, any of those kinds of things. Those are not kosher. You can't eat those insects. Now, again, most of us don't ever come into contact with that because those are not dietary staples amongst our cultures that we are normally with in the United States. I, like many people who will go to some of these countries like China, they will serve you, if you're in the right place at the right time, like I have been, a plate full of bugs. And you look at them and go, I don't eat bugs. And they say, well, we know you don't eat animals. You already told us you're a vegetarian, but surely you can eat these plate of bugs. And I had to tell them, no, I don't eat bugs either. And so the bugs, I couldn't even, I mean, I looked at them and I didn't want to look at them, but I didn't want to eat the plate of bugs. It was a little hors d'oeuvre.
Were they alive?
No, they were not alive. They were crunchy.
But if you put chocolate over them, I mean, you can eat them.
Yeah. No, you can't. They're not kosher. Now I
But
didn't
if
get
you put chocolate on anything, it has to be kosher.
I will, yes, I will tell you that the Chinese were in some cases, I know they were offended by this, because what was weird is that they really didn't think that they understood what a vegetarian was. They just didn't understand that when I was a vegetarian, that it meant that I wouldn't eat those things as well, like higher form of animal in their minds. But they thought, okay. But what was interesting too is that they also, I remember at one dinner that I went to, they served me these, I guess it was a local staple or specialty, were these shrimp, these big shrimp. And I guess they were very expensive. I don't know. And I wouldn't eat them. And the person who was hosting this event was very offended. And they told me later that she was very offended that I wouldn't eat them. And they said, well, we told them that you don't eat meat or chicken, but they thought that you would eat these. And so she was very upset that you wouldn't eat them. And I said, but I won't eat, and they said, well, wouldn't you eat them just because of her? Because, she's your host, and because, you're trying to, develop a relationship, a partnership. I said, I don't care. I'm not going to eat it. I'm not going to eat it because I'm not going to eat it for the sake of for the sake of appearances. And it really was interesting because they really couldn't understand that commitment to not doing something for the sake of business. Because in China, essentially what they were saying is we'll do anything in order to get a business deal done, including eating whatever the person sets before you. And I just, it was pretty obvious that we had very different opinions of what, of what was important as far as the, what we're willing to negotiate on. And I will also tell you that many of those meals in China that I've had, there was tremendous, copious amounts of alcohol drunk, which was also interestingly part of the negotiations or business relationship was drinking, which is not just China. I know that in Japan, I haven't been to Japan, but I know that in Japan, drinking and in Korea, that's part of the established protocol of establishing relationships with somebody, is that you drink with them. And I understand that, but it's not as big of an issue in Jewish tradition that you have to kind of culminate or celebrate with alcohol. But there was, a time and a place for it in Judaism, but it really, interesting enough, wasn't so much business related. There was almost an understanding that business isn't the time to drink, that business and doing livelihood stuff was not the time to drink, that drinking was celebratory, and definitely weddings and festive things were times to drink and times to celebrate. So weddings and things like that were definitely, was proper. Holidays, even celebrations. I mean, again, the wonderful scene in Fiddler on the Roof where he's drinking, they're drinking to celebrate the wedding, the upcoming nuptials with Laser Wolf. Those celebrations were part of Jewish tradition, but they were celebrations for the sake of celebrating life. They weren't part of business. And there was, I think, and interestingly, Judaism didn't look at business as a time to drink. That gets back to the alcohol part, but it is what it is. So it says, so after reading about, again, coming into contact with those things, again, you shall not eat any of the things that swarm on the earth, anything that crawls on its belly. And then it says, anything, you shall not draw abomination upon yourselves through anything that swarms. You shall not make yourselves unclean therewith, and thus become unclean. For I, the Lord, am your God. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not make yourselves unclean through any swarming thing that moves upon the earth. For I, the Lord, am he who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy. And that's the phrase that we use throughout the rest of Leviticus, this concept of being kadosh. You shall be holy, for I am holy. Ki kadosh ani. And so this idea of being holy, this is why we do these things that we do. To be holy, to be holy, to be like God. These are the instructions concerning animals, birds, all living creatures that move in water, and all creatures that swarm on earth, for distinguishing between the unclean and the clean, between the living things that may be eaten and the living things that may not be eaten. And that is the way the portion ends. With, again, this understanding that we have a responsibility to uphold a lifestyle that's going to allow us to live, that's going to help our families and our communities live, that we have a responsibility to some extent for not just ourselves, but for people that are going to come in contact with us and depend on us. Because the reality is that if other people aren't keeping these laws and we're the ones keeping the laws, the weird thing is that people actually get to live longer by following these laws. And what's interesting is that for the most part, we live in a country that does consider food safety to be something that we find to be very important. It's not the case in many parts of the world. There is not the same commitment to cleanliness. And I will tell you this, generally speaking, I know someone's going to say, yeah, but what about this? What about that? Generally speaking, when this becomes important is when we eat living things. Generally speaking, food safety is paramount when it involves eating animals. Generally speaking, most cases, you're not going to die from eating a bad piece of toast. Generally speaking, you're not going to die from eating a bad carrot. People die every day from salmonella, from E. coli, from bacteria found in animals that were not slaughtered correctly, not stored correctly, not protected in the various stages of production. And again, kind of end where we began, the discussion of what we eat and eating animals. And we just have to be very careful when it comes to eating animals. And again, I'm not going to lecture people about vegetarianism and those kind of things, but I will tell you this. We got to be careful, and we think we take it for granted living in this country that we live in, that the food we eat is going to be safe. And for those who've traveled overseas to places like China or Russia or other major population hubs, major countries of tremendous power, these countries have very little in the way of dietary safety. China does a little bit more now, but it's still, I hate to tell you, and I've talked to people in China about this, if you pay for a better health rating, you will get a better health rating simply by bribing the official. It is a well-known, very accepted form of running restaurants. And so you cannot, and again, I know it happens here, that there are crooked health inspectors, and I know that we're not perfect, but generally speaking, and we punish those people in this country, and generally speaking, there's rotation, so you have to pay off lots of people because you're not going to have the same health inspector come all the time, because we know that people can be bribed. So generally speaking, there will be a rotation of people that will come to certify a place. We take this very seriously, and for most of the time, you and I we can sleep at night and never think about this, but it is a very important issue, and it's something that we unfortunately, when we travel overseas, I commend you. If you don't want to be a vegetarian overseas, I get it, but unless you're in a country where you really trust and really, really know whether the health departments are keeping the foods clean, and again, most of Europe is okay. There's definitely a real threat that comes through eating meat that may not be protected. And I will tell you, you cannot judge it by the fact that the restaurant is a 5-star restaurant, or that it's in a 5-star hotel, or it's a nice area, or that the building looks clean, because there's way too many people that are getting paid off in those places. And it's disconcerting. So I will tell you that I've been very lucky. I've never gotten sick in these places in China. So I will tell you, I've been there 5 times. I haven't been sick, but I will tell you, it does concern me. And it is something that obviously, as we're thinking about now in this country, we may be dealing with the effects of the way health has been maintained for animals in China. And I just want to tell you something. If that's the case, I'm not saying it is the case, but if this did start in a wet market in Wuhan, you have to understand that this is a serious issue, which we're still not dealing with. And until we actually hold those countries responsible for the way that they're slaughtering animals and the way that they're taking care of the world, we can't do business with them. Because if they can infect us and we can get sick halfway around the world, there has to be consequences for it. And that's not a political statement. That's just a fact of life. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, whatever you are, we live in a world that's too small now for us not to take these things seriously. And there has to be economic consequences for countries that are not protecting their citizens and therefore not protecting us. So with that, hopefully everyone will stay safe, that you'll continue to be healthy in the coming days. Again, tonight, we definitely think about those who perished during the Holocaust, and again, those who survived and continue to inspire us. And as long as they're still with us, we're grateful for their stories of survival. And if you have a chance over the coming days, the day or so, to reflect and to read a little bit about the Shoah, or to remember, we'll do that and figure out ways to honor them as well. So thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. And
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
great to see you. It's great to see you all. Take care, everybody. Be well.
Okay, take care.
Great lesson. Thank you. Good night.
Right.